Hello, Donald Trump. Let's talk about him. His approval, as I'm speaking, is around every 2 out of 5 Americans at the moment. So, on an aggregate of polls, on average, around 40% of Americans say they approve of Donald Trump. Now, most of that support is concentrated in the US South and the US West. The West and South show similar political behavior for reasons that we'll explore in a bit, but for now, let's just focus on the US South here. Now, as we can see on this map, which kind of tells you about the voting behavior of each state, the US South, this region, is consistently more conservative than the US North, which is this region. But the North historically was just that, and we can see that that's much, much more blue. So it's not just that the South is more conservative, it's that it's consistently more conservative than the US North. And this forms a block of culturally similar states with a shared identity and shared beliefs and shared values. And it is a question of values that divides North and South here. Because it's not just that the North and South happen to vote differently. This is such a stark difference, is that there's clearly a deeper reason to this. And this deeper reason is that the North and South have basically different values. Now, it's important not to generalize. We're talking about huge nations of people here, but we can, and sociology studies do, speak of different nations with different modal and normative values. So, different values that are most common in that society, modal values, and normative values, values which are the norm for that society, which kind of form the center of their own political spectrum. Now, many studies of the South will tell you that the South is much more traditionalist and much more religious than the North is. And what's important to note in the South is that these are what legitimize policies. For many Southerners, what makes a policy worth enacting or not worth enacting is based on its accordance with tradition and religion. So tradition and religion we're seeing to a much greater degree in the South and the North. Again, this is an overgeneralization, but again, we can also talk of modal and normative values. Tradition and religion play a much greater role in moral and political decision making in the South and the North. And not only that, in many parts of the South, especially the rural South, religion is the linchpin around which people's lives are organized. People's church is their identity, it's their community, and it performs the social security functions, which often in the North are outsourced to the federal government. Another thing we see in Southern rhetoric and policies is that of capitalist meritocracy, the idea that where you are in the socioeconomic ladder of society reflects your genuine talent, which is one of the deeper reasons why minimum wages are very, very low in the South, for example, $5, $5.50, $7, and why unionization rates are very, very low in the South, and why there's a much greater normative acceptance of capitalism and a much greater demonization of socialism. All of these things will be familiar to you, whereas in the North, although those elements do exist, they're not dominant in the same way. What I'm trying to say is that these two regions, North and South, have a different understanding of morality, different values, and different cultures. So that Democrat-Republican divide is deeper than just two-party voting. There are two distinct sets of national norms here. The political spectrum of both the North and the South will overlap, of course. The point is these are different political spectrums. This spectrum is shifted considerably to the right compared to the North's political spectrum. Sorry, I'm bad with technology. But it's not just that they differ on values, it's everything. It's all these things: poverty, HDI, happiness, religiosity, high school education, life expectancy, all these things that form the basic fingerprint of a society. We can see poverty rates in the US South are much, much higher than the North. In many counties, over a fifth of people are living above or below the poverty line. In fact, in Alabama in 2010, around 1 in 5 people didn't have consistent access to food, which is the same rate as Sri Lanka. In HDI, consistently lower in the South. Mississippi's HDI, by the way, is the same as that of Saudi Arabia. Happiness. The South is generally less happy than North. Not really surprising considering these. Religiosity. We're seeing not only is the South much more religious than North, but religiosity in general. It's concentrated in the South and it's most rejected in New England here. High school diploma or higher. In many counties in the South, a majority of people do not have a high school degree, as we can see here. And then life expectancy. Of course, a huge difference between the South and North that we can all notice. Other things that the South and North differ on. Fox viewership, the difference in education spending per student, labor union membership, even the percentage of adults who say that they personally perform or create artwork. So this is the kind of basic proximal reason of why it is that the North and South have such different values, such different politics, because they're living in fundamentally different environments. And human beings are a product of their environments. But if you're living in an environment where there's much more poverty, there's much less life expectancy, there's much less education, there's much more religiosity, you're obviously going to think differently and believe different things and conceive morality and politics in different ways. That's not really surprising. But because we also kind of know it. We know that at birth, someone born in the North and someone born in the South aren't inherently different. They're shaped by their environment. The real question is why these environments formed. So, this is a skeleton of what this whole video is going to be. The root cause here is geography, because human nature is constant across genetic groups. As we said, North and South, they're not fundamentally different. They're not born as a Democrat or a Republican. They become different over time. And human beings have a propensity for a wide range of values. For example, they can be the kind of extremely far-right paramilitary extremist groups that you see in the South, like the Proud Boys or the Oath Keepers, or they can be like a liberal arts student in New England, you know? So these values are shaped by our socioeconomic and institutional environments. People are made by their environments. But these intangible factors, the stuff like education levels, religiosity, HDI, poverty levels, the root cause of that, the original environment is shaped by geography. So what's happened here is that the North has a geography which caused the development of institutions that facilitated economic development, and that included investments into public goods like education, healthcare, infrastructure, etc. And as we'll discuss what those institutions were and why it caused the North to develop. In the South, geography led to a very different set of institutions developing, which hindered economic development, which has led to all this stuff that we can see today, which has led to a difference in moral and political values. So, let's start by discussing the North. Just note back to this slide. As you can see, I've got a really high-tech setup. So let's start with the North here. Just to be clear, the North isn't like the entire United States above a line of latitudes. It's a distinct cultural region, often defined by the number of states above this green line here, the Mason-Dixon line. So nowadays, the North tends to be just to the right of my pinky, like Missouri, Iowa, that kind of stuff. But historically, the North was just this. So, and this is important because we're now talking about the underlying history of the North, which caused it to develop the institutions that it did. So just note, in the original North here, we have New England, which is everything to the right of my finger here, just this kind of peninsula here, and the middle colonies, which is like New York, Pennsylvania, Delaware. So nowadays, New England, as we can see, is the most northern area of the US, both geographically and socioeconomically. As we saw on those slides earlier, it's the most developed, the most educated, the most politically progressive, the least religious area of the entire USA. And we see this because the underlying factors that caused the US North to develop were strongest in New England. So what's happening in both the North as a whole, and especially New England, is that the climate is much cooler because the altitude is higher, and the soil is much rockier, which means you can't go grow cash crops like tobacco or India, or cotton, which means you can't get like an aristocrat or a capitalist coming over and making a huge amount of money. So these regions were not settled by established elites in England who were looking to build a new society that made them lots of money. However, there were lots of coasts here, there were lots of marketable fish, you could fish here. You also had great natural harbors for sailing. So what happened is the North, and especially New England, was settled mostly by Puritans fleeing religious persecution who are expressly trying to create a better society. Same with the middle colonies here of like New York, New Jersey, Delaware, Pennsylvania. They were trying to make better societies, which were more equitable than those in England. So they established basic rights like freedom of religion, no taxation without representation. They arrested many of the royally appointed rulers of these states throughout history. And in fact, they established strong democratic native legislators where all people, but not black people, could vote. They also prioritized education teaching. So everyone, regardless of social class, again, not so much for black people, were able to read the Bible. That meant the literacy rates were high, which is really, really important in establishing a developed society. People need to read. Also, rivers were used for like grain mills, sawmills, harbors were used for trade. The point is, the North became a society based on commerce and manufacturing, which is conducive for economic development. So the quality of life was high, and material standard of living was often higher than in England. What I'm trying to say is that in the North, Northerners established institutions that were conducive to economic development. What is an institution? An institution is a sort of structure in society which forms part of the overall system of it. Like whenever people talk about things being systemic or systematic, they're talking about being embedded in the society's institutions. So institutions, it's stuff like the government, the legislature, the law courts, the police, the universities, the schools, the economic laws, the monopoly laws, labor laws, the system of economic organization, all this kind of basic underlying factors of a society. Now, institutional economics is a whole subfield of economics which focuses on how different institutions lead to different lead to differing amounts of prosperity and development. It's part of or rather it overlaps with another big school of economics called developmentalist economics, which is all about, it's like a subfield of economics which is focused on economic development of countries and has certain prescriptions for doing so. Now, there's lots of books you can read about institutional economics, but I really recommend one called Why Nations Fail. And it's by these two Nobel Prize-winning political scientists in economics called Acemoglu and Robinson. And they distinguish between different kinds of institutions. They talk about economic institutions and political institutions. Let's focus on economic institutions first. An inclusive economic institution is when the structures of society, when it comes to the economy, are built in such a way that everyone has the basic ability to own stuff. The government can't arbitrarily confiscate it, or different social classes can't arbitrarily confiscate it. Everyone has basic property rights, and all citizens are able to make profits. In inclusive economic institutions, or economic institutions that allow the wealth of a society to be enjoyed by a broader stratum of people. So, for example, institutional economic institutions are ones with stronger labor laws to prevent exploitation, stronger competition laws to prevent monopolies, things like that. And in a society with inclusive economic institutions, all strata of society are interested in being productive so that they can make money. Generally, this is good. In contrast, I say generally, it's always good. In contrast, extractive economic institutions, when the institutions of society are designed to allow an elite at the top to make a huge amount of money at the expense of exploiting everyone below. Basically, the vast majority of all states before very recently were built like this. And even now, many, if not most states, still have strongly extractive political institutions. And often, extractive economic institutions are supported by extractive political institutions, which concentrate political power in the hands of a narrow elite, for example, an oligarchy, which then use that political power to maintain extractive economic institutions so that that elite keeps making more and more money. So when a society has exclusive political institutions, I said extractive political institutions, I meant exclusive political institutions, my bad. In a society with exclusive political institutions, people don't enjoy basic rights. Power is used to repress people and enforce repressive extractive economic institutions. In contrast, pluralistic political institutions are when more people, a wider range of people, enjoy political power and basic rights. However, the central state is still very strong. There's no feudal lords or warlords contesting for power. There's one state with a strong amount of power, but lots of people, a wide base of society, has a say in how that state is run. So a classic example of this is like a modern democracy. It tends to have pluralistic political institutions. For example, Western European democracies. And dictatorships, such as like Russia, China, North Korea, have exclusive political institutions. Now, historically, the northern United States had comparatively very pluralistic political institutions and inclusive economic institutions. Both these things are crucial for economic development. And the North had these institutions because it was a society based on commerce and manufacturing. So it had no need for slavery. Slavery was still employed in the North in the 1700s and early 1800s, but the society's economy wasn't built on it. It was more profitable for employers to give people wages. So in factories, it's more profitable for the employer to give people a wage than let them go away. In plantations, it's more profitable for the employer to maintain slaves. So the Northern economy wasn't based on slavery. All of this, by the way, all the stuff that I've just mentioned with the North and its institutions and the wage-based mode of production mirrors Great Britain. Great Britain was also a commerce and industry-based economy where institutions were comparatively pluralistic and inclusive compared to other nations. Another thing to note, in Great Britain, wages were the highest, some of the highest rates out of all countries in the world. Obviously, in Great Britain in the early 1800s and late 1700s, wages were still incredibly low by modern standards, very much approaching poverty and starvation wages, often starvation wages, which was commented on by reformers a lot of the time. The point is, in Great Britain, comparative to other countries in the world, wages were very high. And there was also a very extensive financial infrastructure. It was very easy for manufacturers to get loans, to get credit. Banks were established and formed a strong commercial infrastructure, which means you had a situation in Great Britain where labor was very expensive, but capital was very much available. And this encouraged people, or manufacturers rather, to invest in labor-saving machinery, for example, machines and steam engines, and to invest in the technological development of that machinery, which means that in Great Britain and in the USA, you got industrialization, because the same processes happened in both the UK and the USA, that labor capital thing. In contrast, in the South did not have an extensive banking system, so it was harder to get loans, and it had slavery. The South had very, very cheap labor, so it never had any incentive to invest in modern technology or machinery. By the way, that situation is very much like it was in ancient Rome. So ancient Rome invented steam engines at around the 2nd century AD. So the technology for industrialization was there in ancient Rome. It just never happened because nobody had the desire to invest in uncertain labor-saving machinery, which needed lots of refinement and technological innovation and investment, because the labor was free for Roman landlords and aristocrats, and they weren't trying to make stuff, they were just farming. So it was more profitable for Roman landlords and aristocrats just to use slavery. The exact same situation predominated in the South, and it's one of the big reasons why it didn't industrialize. Now, let's look at the South. The South was built to do the exact opposite of the North. Its institutions were shaped to lead to a fundamentally different society to benefit fundamentally different people. Let's look at the geography here. The latitudes, the temperature, and the soil all allows the South to grow cash crops like tobacco, indigo, rice, and crucially, cotton. So in the 1600s and 1700s, it was colonized by aristocrats from England who were using the South to make money. They shipped in slaves as a labor force for a rural agrarian economy. There was a middle tier in the South of the white subsistence farmers who you called yeomen, but they were poor and they didn't have political power. The aristocratic planters who came in from England and colonized the South established a system where they monopolized political power, and they established exclusive political institutions and extractive economic institutions to maintain that political and economic hegemony. The whole point of Southern institutions was to funnel wealth up from the soil as farmed by slaves and deliver it into the hands of the planter class for luxury consumption. And all of this was centered around the commodity of cotton, ever since Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin. So for the 1800s, essentially. So this is really, really bad for development for loads of reasons. One of them is that obviously slaves and yeomen aren't incentivized to be productive at all. But crucially, nobody in this society is incentivized to be innovative or inventive at all, because the planters are making huge fat stacks of cash and everyone else is too poor or unfree to want to innovate or even have the education to learn how to innovate. So society remains stagnant, both development-wise and economically, but it also remains stagnant politically. You don't see the kind of progressive shift in the South that you see in the North throughout the 1800s. If anything, in the 1800s, the South went backwards from mostly believing in the early 1800s that slavery was a necessary evil, to believing by the time of the Civil War that slavery was a positive good that was a morally just thing to do. So the South remains stagnant because of this. Cheap labor, profitable crops, no economic incentive to invest in industrialization. Society remains agricultural, unequal, and rural. And this is really, really bad for development. It's terrible. It's sort of a death blow. No agrarian nation is going to become a modern nation. You have to industrialize. Every nation in the world with modern standards of living is one which is an industrial one. Even nations which we associate with a sort of post-industrial service economy, like Singapore and Switzerland, are actually part of the top 3 manufacturing nations in the world by manufacturing value added per capita. Economies like the UK and the USA, these advanced Western economies, which we kind of also associate with having a post-industrial economy, these are some of the biggest manufacturing nations in the world. These are the top 10 manufacturing nations in the world. That's not causing employment, obviously. Whilst the UK and the USA are still manufacturing economies, the most employment in these countries is not in manufacturing, but the overall economy is still based on making stuff. You've got to make stuff. But what's happening here is that in the South, throughout the 1700s, the 1800s, it remains this agrarian, quasi-feudalist nation. It's this feudal nation where you have a narrow aristocratic elite, a sort of middle tier of subsistence farmers, and a large labor force of slaves with no political rights. So the Southern elite is making huge stacks of cash. It wants to maintain that position, so it maintains these very exclusive political and economic institutions. So a fantastic analogy of what's going on with the South are oil states now. So petrostates in, for example, the Gulf, but also in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, Angola, which are exclusively based on oil. So loads of states in sub-Saharan Africa in general actually have huge, incredible natural resources like lithium, gold, diamond, oil, but they're really, really underdeveloped. So contrast this with like Germany or Japan, which have very few natural resources but are highly developed. So this is a recognized phenomenon in development economics. It's called the natural resource curse, which refers to how a country blessed by huge amounts of really profit-generating natural resources can turn out to be really underdeveloped. And it's because what happens is when you have a country with loads of really, really lucrative natural resources, if one group manages to monopolize that, they gain a huge amount of power. They then use that power to create economic and political institutions which screw over the remainder of the country to benefit them and make them lots of money, and society stagnates. And GDP per capita may be high, for example, in the antebellum South or in the Gulf states nowadays, but this is going to but all the money is going to a very narrow stratum of people who are pushing up that average and are wasting it on luxury consumption instead of national development. So in the oil states, for example, only like less than a third of people in all these Gulf states are enjoying basic human rights and full citizenship. The vast majority of these people are living in poverty in like barracks, for example. There's another fantastic analogy for the South, Latin America. Latin America, in its history, its institutions, and its current political values, resembles the US South in basically every way, whereas the US South's history and institutions does not resemble any of the other Western nations. So not the US North, not Canada, not Australia, New Zealand, not Western Europe. Let me explain this. So what happens in Latin America is that conquistadors arrive in areas where cash crops can be grown or cash minerals such as silver and gold can be extracted. They come in, they enslave a huge subject population of Native Americans or imported black people from Africa, and they establish institutions which are very extractive and very exclusive in order to maintain this aristocratic conquistador class which funnels wealth out of the whole society. So these Latin American states in the 1800s, 1700s, they're ultra hierarchical. And even when they gain independence, even when slavery is abolished, even when industrialization starts to occur throughout the 1800s and 1900s, these societies remain very unequal, very underdeveloped, very rife with corruption, because those institutions, those structures of society are still designed to be unjust. They're still designed to funnel wealth to an elite. The elite might change, but the society doesn't. It's why in loads of communist countries like Russia, China, you have a revolution, but what happens is not fundamental change, but just one elite gets replaced with another elite, because the institutions that generate powerful oligarchy elites are still there. Now, this is exactly what happened in the US South. These same processes, but the US South is not as underdeveloped as Latin American countries. And that's because the South happened to gain independence being in the same state as the US North. So the South is still covered by the same federal institutions imposed by the North that are more just, that are more inclusive, more pluralistic than the political institutions of the South itself. And because of these better institutions, the South sees institutions of property rights throughout time for white people, democracy for white people beginning in the 1830s, stronger anti-monopoly laws, stronger antitrust laws, all this kind of stuff. So the US South is different from Latin American countries purely because it happened to be independent in the same state as the US North, and it was subject to those beneficial institutions. But if that wasn't the case, it would be exactly like Latin American states now, but with a different dominant ethnic group, because the underlying factors that have caused the Latin American states to be in their current state of development still apply to the US South. Now, the South, before World War II, was a mostly agrarian country, and it was an agricultural country. The economy was based on resource extraction, exactly the same in the Latin American countries. However, after the war, the South was industrial for a few decades. It was making stuff during the post-war economic boom. But what it was doing was the South was making stuff, but it was giving workers low levels of wages. It had very little statewide investment in education. So what was happening is that the manufacturing that was happening in the US South after World War II was low-cost, low-skill manufacturing. And after the 70s, it became much harder for the South to do this as globalization took place and corporations started outsourcing manufacturing to even poorer nations where they could pay them even less. So what's happening nowadays in the 21st century is that the South is really so Republican leaders and state legislators in the South are really trying to compete to attract companies. They're crushing unions, they're restricting minimum wages, they are So, for example, giving hundreds of billions of dollars in tax cuts and corporate welfare to large corporations. So, for example, Bobby Jindal in Louisiana fired tens of thousands of public sector employees to give tax breaks to large corporations, but it's not working. Manufacturers in the US South throughout the 21st century have been gradually moving, often to Mexico, where they can pay their workers even less. The US South cannot compete on the basis of like low cost, low skill manufacturing because the South is still subject to northern federal institutions and it can't pay people like $6 or $5 a day. Whereas in Mexico, in the current state of Mexico in manufacturing plants, many workers are paid in single digit numbers of dollars per day. They're paid poverty wages and starvation wages. So the South is trying to compete with these nations in manufacturing, and it just can't do it. Hence why when you look at the South, you see these southern states, often the minimum wages are like $5, $7 per hour, because these states are trying to attract private investment. They're trying to develop their countries by attracting private investment, and it's just not working. It's making these states even less developed. Whereas in states like California or in Western Europe, they attract companies by investing heavily in public goods like education, infrastructure, amenities. And what's happening is that they are establishing higher skilled, higher cost industries, which are paying their workers higher wages because they have to, because these companies can't just outsource production to countries like Mexico or China or Vietnam or Thailand or Bangladesh, because they need that high skilled workforce. So very, very different models of economic development. This one, the southern one, is not working, and it's locking the South in a cycle. And here's one of the key things to understand. Economic development is one of the main contributors to societies getting more progressive. So what's happening here is this kind of vicious cycle whereby the South has institutions which were poorly conducive for development. This means to a lack of development. This leads to more conservatism. This means for a lesser desire to reform the institutions of the South and change its economic approach from low cost, low skilled labor to high cost, high skilled labor by public investment. And we just get this vicious cycle here. So look at this map. This is a really, really, really amazing map. And what it's basically doing is just mapping different nations in the world by how progressive or how conservative they are. Now, progressive and conservatives, these are concepts we all have some idea of, but how do we kind of measure them scientifically? How do we reduce these to scientific variables? So this cultural world map is made by these two political scientists, Inglehart and Wellesley. And they define progressiveness and conservativeness by these two kind of sets of values here. I don't know if you can see that. That says, wait, let me move out of the way. Survival versus self-expression values. So what do these mean? Traditional values, as we can see with countries on this kind of lower end of the y-axis, emphasize the importance of religion, family values, deference to authority, and parent-child ties. And people who embrace these values also reject divorce, abortion, euthanasia, suicide. These societies tend to have very high levels of national pride and nationalism, and obviously a nationalistic outlook. Now, rational values or secular values at the top end of this y-axis have the opposite preference to these traditional values. Societies which embrace secular rational values tend to base their moral and political decision-making not on the basis of authority, traditional religion, as these societies do, but on the basis of evidence and science. And these tend to see divorce, abortion, euthanasia, and suicide as relatively more acceptable. And what happens when societies develop economically, when they industrialize, they shift from traditional values to rational values. What's basically happening, it's been described by these two political scientists, Engelbrecht and Igren, as essentially the replacement of religion and superstition with science and bureaucracy as the basis of behavior and authority relations in a society. Now, societies can also become more progressive by shifting from, you can't really see it, but that label says survival values to self-expression values. And what's happening is that at this end of the x-axis, you have survival values, which place emphasis on economic and physical security. They're linked with tolerance for authoritarianism, a relatively ethnocentric outlook, low levels of trust and tolerance, and xenophobia. Now, self-expression values, as we can see to societies on this side of the map, are values which give high priority to well-being, self-expression, individual freedom, and quality of life. So these kind of values, societies with a more self-expressive value system tend to place more emphasis on environmental protection, tolerance of foreigners, gender equality, tolerance of gay people and lesbian people, and a rising demand for participating in society, a rising desire for democracy, a rising desire for civil and political liberties, a greater sense of interpersonal trust, political moderation, and a shift in child rearing values from emphasis on hard work to emphasis of imagination and tolerance. Now, especially when societies develop and when they become post industrial, when they shift from industrial manufacturing nations to post industrial service based nations, they tend to kind of progress on this part of the x axis here. So, we have all these Western states here, and you can see the Western states are the most progressive states in the world. They're closest to this bit of the map. But we can see out of all the Western states, the USA is in fact one of the most conservative of all Western states. The only states which are more conservative in the West are Portugal and arguably Italy, but even Italy is more secular rational than the USA is. So this makes sense, by the way. The USA is a very right-wing country. So according to a 2025 Gallup poll, 37% of American voters identify as conservative or very conservative, and 25% identify as liberal or very liberal. In contrast, in a 2025 poll in Britain, 29% of people said that they were left-wing, and 26% of people said that they were conservative. So the US, much, much more right-wing country. Also, 2/5 of people in the USA said in a 2025 poll that being gay was morally unacceptable. It's also worth noting, just as a reminder, 2/5 of Americans still approve of Trump. I'm not saying those are the same people, but probably a big overlap. And we can see here, but also if we diffracted the USA into the north and south, I guarantee you the northern USA would be somewhere over here, more comfortably nestled amongst Western nations, and the southern USA would be over here, much, much more resembling Catholic Europe and Latin America, as we can see here, than other Western nations. But this just takes into account the whole of the USA. And as we can see here, how progressive a country is correlates really, really well with economic development. We have over here the Nordic countries, the most developed nations in the entire world. Over here, Anglophone countries, which are still very developed, but not quite on the level of like Germany, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, the Nordic countries. We've got like Catholic Europe here, so like Central Europe. We've got Eastern Europe, Western and South Asia, Latin America a bit further down. And over here we have what these political scientists refer to as African Islamic countries, countries in the Middle East and North Africa and in sub-Saharan Africa. And of course, these include the Gulf states, which are very, very wealthy. But the key thing to understand here is that in the Gulf states, only a small fraction of people are actually wealthy. Only a small fraction of people actually have citizenship and large amounts of disposable income. The majority of people in the Gulf states are resident workers who have no basic human rights and extremely poor material standard of living. So the society as a whole is not more wealthy in the Gulf states. The society as a whole is still really rather poor. Now, of course, economic development is not the only factor that's contributing to how progressive these countries are. So we can also see that there are these sort of cultural designators here, like Orthodox Europe, Catholic Europe, the African Islamic world of sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East and North Africa, Latin America, Protestant Europe, which is like Northern and Northwest Europe. So, of course, cultural factors are also an explanation for progressive or conservativeness. But here's the thing, just look at this, right? These cultural designators here are really just regional ones. All of these countries are in the same geographic place. All of these countries are in the same geographic place. All these countries are in the same geographic place. And here, and with the Middle East and North Africa, and in sub-Saharan Africa. So what's happening here is that because these countries are the same geography, they develop similar cultures because the geography causes institutions of these countries to develop in similar ways. So, for example, in Orthodox Europe, all these countries are in Eastern Europe, which share the same geographic factors, which cause the institutions of these societies to develop in certain ways, which leads to certain cultural and political differences. Same thing with Northern Europe, same thing with Central Europe. So what's happening is geography has shaped these countries' institutions to affect people's thinking in a certain way. Now, what I could do and what I'm kind of tempted to do is talk about why is it the case that economic development leads to countries becoming more progressive? Why is that? What's the underlying psychology of that? However, I feel as if I've spoken enough. I don't want to make this a super long video. And that's something which I've spoken out in other videos and which I'm definitely going to speak about in the future again. So I won't be discussing that for now. I'm going to end this video here. So I hope that was informative. I hope